want to ask me a question?
Sure. So this group of religious leaders have once again called for your resignation and have cited numerous examples for why they believe that you should step down. With this new call for your resignation, are you considering it?
Consider stepping down?
Mm-hmm.
No, I have no intention of stepping down. I've got 4-year terms. I was elected by the people, and the people have to decide whether they want me as a sheriff or someone else. I can tell you that I am concerned with this kind of letter, and I certainly understand when you get a group of pastors together. And, some have marched around my building, some have met with me, some have said they would like to work with me, others don't feel that way. But I can tell you that fundamentally what they've issued here is for the most part, is either wrong or has never come to court to make a decision on what happened or what didn't happen. They're reaching back into the past with some things that had nothing to do with racism. The one I know in particular is the one about either go to jail, go to the cemetery, or run out of town. That was at a speech given about gangs. It wasn't African American gangs, it wasn't white gangs, it wasn't Latino gangs, it was gangs. And I was asked the question, as sheriff and as law enforcement, what do you plan to do about the gangs? And I said, well, we're going to deal with it either by running them out of town, by putting them in jail, or taking them to the cemetery. Now, the taking to the cemetery remark was made because at that particular day when I gave that speech, we had an unusually high amount of young men that were being killed in these rival gang situations, and simply we were the ones who would arrive and have to see that they got to the funeral home to go to the cemetery. So those are the kind of things that when they're taken out of context, that I can't respond to that. I won't even try.
Last time we spoke, you said that that you are appointed by the majority, or you were voted by the
Correct.
majority. What is your message to the minority and those who did not vote for you or who feel, unfond of you right now?
It's always been the same. As sheriff, I'm sheriff of all the people, whether they're African American, whether they're Hispanic, whether they're female, whether they're male, whether they're Caucasian. When you look at the breakdown, for instance, of our county, we're roughly about 17% African American and maybe another 2% Hispanic, and the rest are Caucasian. In the city of Chattanooga, that number's higher. You have 37%. That being said, I am also sheriff over people who live inside Chattanooga, just like I am Lookout Mountain or any of the other cities. I take very serious the call to have a balance of employees in the sheriff's department. And to that end, I have met with a number of groups, including I think a number of these pastors that are on this list, to tell them what I need is a coalition of pastors to help me, first of all, work within their own communities to try to stop the violence that we see and try to stop whether it's the drugs or whether it's the violence that we see among young people. But more than that, what I need is recruitment. Give me some young men and women that I can hire who can become law enforcement agents. And the more you spend your career as a law enforcement officer, the more you rise through the rank and the more say you have in terms of balance to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind. That hasn't happened so far. I cannot tell you one pastor who has brought me an African American in the last 6 months that I can put to work or call me about doing that. That's what I want to see. They say they want me to show up and fix the problems by resigning. I'm saying give me the help I need to see that we have young men and women who can move up the ranks and can develop a career. On the way over here today, I stopped to have car washed, and as I was in there, and I certainly won't name who it is, but it was a Chattanooga police officer, seasoned officer, African American officer, who said, Jim, I'm going to hang it up next year. I just can't continue to deal with this when we're, as police officers, we're being attacked from all directions, when we know the training we have is to protect all the citizens. And these kind of things, I don't know how you deal with it. I said, well, I decided a long time ago that my principles would be based on, as I've said this before, as a Christian, biblically based principles of treating everybody equal, helping people find what they want in their career and their goals, helping get there regardless of their color. I certainly contest the idea that they think I'm racist, because as sheriff, I will stand by what's called law and order, and I will defend my men, whether they're black or white. Little known that in the last few months, I had a black officer that was involved in a shooting. Not one word was said to me about that, not the first word. Had another incident with the same officer a couple of weeks later, not one word. But you let a white officer go do it and everybody goes crazy. I'm saying let's have some balance.
Despite whether any officer who was involved in these incidents, whether they're black or white, every controversial incident your deputies have been involved in, would you consider them isolated incidents? Because I know in the letter, the clergy referred to them as not being isolated, but as a collection of whether it's training or what they were taught.
That's a good question. And one of the reasons I chose to join CALIA, which is the flag you see here, was so that we would have over 400, almost 500 standards of how we police, like any law enforcement agency that I think is on a cutting edge. City of Chattanooga has the CALIA. 911 Center has the CALIA. So it's a way that you can make sure that you're using the best out there in terms of training men and women to be as balanced and fair and equitable and just when they're out there with folks. What I won't do is get into individual cases, and unfortunately, a lot of these cases, they want me to make comment. Should you fire this one? Should you fire that one? I believe in the process, as I've always said, you treat each employee with what they're entitled to. And so you let the processes go in place. We've got POST, which is the standards by which the state hires and trains police officers. You got CALIA, which is the national agency that trains police officers out there. And in spite of all of that, you're going to have officers who are human mess up. Some of them, it's going to be a fatal mess up. They're going to wind through the court system. They're going to lose their job. Some may even go to jail. By and large, most of them are exonerated once you really get down and look at the case and what all is involved in it. For me, the key here is let due process take place. And I know they allude to that in there. Well, you know, you're always talking these fancy words. That's because we all should have due process. I rue the day that any citizen in this community is judged by a 10 or 15 minute video that's shown on the nightly news. There's a lot more to go on in a case like that. So once again, yes, I plan to defend my officers, black or white. And when they do a job, I'm going to stick behind them, just as I did, as I said, one of my African American officers a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to defend him against those kind of things unless I can be showed what he did was illegal. You can always refer to cases where that came from another department. In most cases, they were exonerated in those cases. That's part of the human experience. When you are a police officer and you have to put your life on the line out the street, the first rule is go home safe. That means when you come up against a suspect that will not cooperate, will not comply, you've got to make sure you use the techniques that you're taught to use them in the fashion you can so that you have what we call force continuum. You only ramp it up enough to get compliance. But if they won't comply, you cannot just take the cuffs off or walk away and leave them. You must take them into custody. So I'm asking that whether you're African American or white or Caucasian or Hispanic or whatever nationality you are, let the system work. Let the wheels of justice turn. I will say this also, you know, I've gotten a lot of hate email. I expect that. Some of the most venomous letters I've ever had in my life. But at the same time, people are constantly telling me, Sheriff, we like what you're doing, stay the course. Once again, I don't know why this happened, but I stopped by and had a car wash. Not only did I have the African American police officer that told me stick in there, but I had another African American walk up to it who was an executive and said, Sheriff, I followed your career for years. I hadn't seen this guy in years. We used to do a little work together on a volunteer basis. He says, you've got to have law and order. Don't neglect law and order. And then the final lady came up to me, who said, listen, my church is putting together, she was Caucasian, she said, my church is putting together gift cards for officers, coffee, things like that, little coffee certificates, because we believe that you're taking the right approach. When you're standing by your men, you're letting the process work, you're letting the courts make the decision so that everybody can feel like there's equal justice for all.
Do you think that the groups that are calling for you to resign represent the majority of Hamilton County, or just the ones that you hear about?
I don't even think they come close to the majority.
Are there any adjustments?
Now, that being said, as I said, I've always been willing to sit down with a group, whether it was pastors, and there's a lot of churches. You know, I think I read one time there's almost 1,000 churches in Hamilton County. That's a lot of pastors. Predominantly the ones that I saw on the list, the letter, are African American churches, but I think there were some others that were white churches as well. But I didn't see any name, maybe one, that I recognized in terms of saying, Sheriff, let's sit around the table and talk about ways to move forward rather than ways to get you to resign.
Are there any changes you're considering implementing in your training or any of your policies?
We're always looking at training. First of all, we look at it in respect to the grants we get that always require you to be able to follow certain training. Post is always adding training. I did see the other day that the governor had asked to put together a committee of law enforcement officers to take a look at the main points that we use in law enforcement, and I'm certainly for that. What I'm not for is adding more and more hours of training to where you can't even put an officer out on the road, because it used to be 40 hours, now it's up to 48 hours of training, with one exception. I would say that we need to have longer academies We need to have the post academy, and then we need to bring them back here and go through what I would refer to as field training officer academy, where they are much longer with the seasoned officer. But guess what? That's extremely expensive. That's where the commissioners are going to have to decide, are we going to put the money in to allow us to have more training? And I'm not throwing them under the bus. I'm just telling you, probably the 3 or 4 best countries in the world in training police, and there may be a few others, but Germany does a great job. Great Britain does a good job. Ireland does a great job. Israel does a great job. But one of the things that marks them is they have much longer academies to make sure that these officers are not 19 and 20 or 21 and given a gun and put out on the road. I want to hire young men and women, but I want them to go through enough training so that when they get out there and they carry a weapon, which is the ultimate authority to decide between life and death, that we give them a lot of alternatives in terms of less force, but that we also make people understand if an officer asks you to comply, comply. When you fight, when you try to run, when you try to create problems, you're asking for problems. Pastors, parents, police, citizens need to tell young people, stop fighting the police, comply. If you got a beef, that's what lawyers are for. That's what your pastor going to the court is for. That's what the judges are for. If we get compliance, you'll find a lot less problem.
So my question is kind of twofold. So first, from everything that we've talked about so far, do you believe that the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office has an issue with excessive force ever being administered to black citizens of Hamilton County?
I can't answer that question because some of the cases that you probably referred to have not been through the court system. I can only tell you that there are a lot of witnesses that will have to testify as to those particular cases. Do I believe our training is based on that? Absolutely not. Post doesn't train to that. We don't train to that. We follow the same rules that everybody's saying they want to see everybody comply with. But individual cases are always going to rear their head. They always make news. You're always going to see them in the news. That's what you guys get paid to do, put it out there. I'm just asking you to be fair and balanced with both sides. That's one of the reasons I'm asking you, put this online. Let the people listen to what I say rather than just a little tidbit here and there. I know you, for time's sake, you have to be very short on the news, but allow the people that want to go hear what Jim Hammond said, every word, and then judge him by that. Winston.
Does your training, what does the majority of your training consist of in terms of using force, de-escalating, and communicating with people within the community? And do you feel like your deputies are well trained in dealing with people who really just don't look like them or from their community?
Sure. That's 2 or 3 questions. I'll start with this force continuum. When I became sheriff, I forget how many years ago now, the first thing I was asked to do is go down to Atlanta and sit down on a new program called de-escalation. It was all about teaching police a better way to use less force out there. We embraced that program. We brought it to Chattanooga under a grant. I asked Chattanooga Police to join me in training. That program is still under the Sheriff's Department, and we have trained over 400 officers on how to de-escalate when you get to a scene. It really came about through a man out of Memphis who they were dealing with a case where a mental health person was killed when the police tried to take him into custody and they fought and lost their life. And so they saw the need for de-escalation. It's one of the best programs we run now. It's required as part of our training. And that's all about trying to talk people down. Force continuum is actually starting with your verbal command, starting with your presence. When a police officer pulls up and he's in uniform, everybody should be taught from their parents and their school teachers and the community. When an officer arrives, the best thing to do is yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, and no ma'am. If you got a beef or an issue, take it up with the courts, take it up with your lawyer. Don't immediately say to the police, I didn't do anything, you're not putting me in jail, that kind of stuff. But if you cannot get compliance simply because you're there and trying to force then you go to what we call less lethal force. First of them is hands, your hands. They are the weapon of getting compliance till you get somebody to settle down. If that doesn't work, then you'd go to some of the other equipment that we might use, including the baton, used only in certain areas and certain purposes. It looks bad, but it ain't much worth it when your mama got a paddle hold of you when you were a little kid and wore you out. You know what that felt like. Nobody liked it. Nobody was going to die from it. Have people died from the baton? I don't know when I've seen a case where actually the forensics showed that that was the case. Even years ago in the chokehold, which we do not do and no department does anymore. So I'm saying force continuum is all about adding just enough force to gain compliance. Once you gain compliance, the officer must stop at that point. One of the issues that's a hot button now is this idea, should another officer intervene? if he thinks that this is beyond the scope. I mentioned the other day in the news conference, the airline industry had to go to, several years ago, ramp up more about the second seat pilot. If he felt like the pilot was really out of line, to speak up, intervene so that you don't lose your own life, but his life and the passenger's. In law enforcement, we are looking at better ways to address that. For an officer, even though it's a senior officer on the scene, to be able to intervene if he thinks there is something going on that is beyond the scope of training. And those things are continued. But if you ask me, do I know of anything that would cause me to think the sheriff's department is racist, or we go out of our way to try to penalize African Americans or any race? The answer is absolutely not. I would also tell you, if you really want to do a search, you can search other law enforcement areas and you'll find cases that have come up with them also. Most of them, thank God, are exonerated. A few of them have led to people going to jail. A few of them have led to terminations.
So this letter is obviously motivated by the national conversation going on about police brutality, whether it exists in certain areas all over the country. And it's a nationwide conversation. What role in general, as the Hamilton County Sheriff, do you feel that you play in this conversation? What is your role as a sheriff, either to take action or what is your role in this conversation?
Most of the people that call me who are calling for my resignation said, Sheriff, we like your calming effect when you say, this is what I stand for, this is what we're going to do as a law enforcement agency. Most people want law and order. They don't want chaos. They don't want anarchy. They don't want bottles thrown. They don't want paint spilled. They don't want statues torn down. They want order. I'm saying that if we're going to have a civilized country, we have got to return to order. And I'm not going to blame it on any particular race or creed or ethnic group, because they're all involved to some degree or another. But I can say the minute you stop having law and order in your community, we're in for a rough ride.
You speak about CALEA, and you said this is one of the reasons. Your CALEA accreditation holds you to a certain standard. Do you feel like if not for the CALEA accreditation, you would have more of these issues?
I always say CALEA makes you a better agency, no matter who you are, because they come in with not only the latest trainings, but one of their incentives is you're eligible for a lot more federal grants, just like this $6 million grant I recently got for mental health. Those kind of things always help when you're CALEA certified. Does it make you a better agent? Absolutely, when you get CALEA certification, because not only do you have the white glove inspection they go through, but just the annual mini inspections to keep you certified. It's expensive. It costs the taxpayers a lot of money. These gentlemen that were here last week for our review, they were very pleased with what they saw. And they won't make the final decision. They'll turn in all of their scores to the national board, who will either award or discredit us in their meeting sometime in the fall. I have no expectation they'll do anything other than approve that we're following the techniques that we're trained to do.
You mentioned that diversifying your force is one way to improve the department.
Absolutely.
So, from your opinion, what are some areas in your specific department, if you don't believe that there's a racism issue within the department, what are some issues that you would like to see resolved, either with that diversification or?
Every department, and remember, I've got close to 500 people, are going to have some inborn prejudicial ideas. People in general are prejudiced, whether they say so or not. I lived for 3 years in a country where they're extremely prejudiced. I've never visited and spent any long time in any country where prejudice did not exist. And it's not always a black and white thing. It can be other races too. You're never going to get rid of that totally from people. I don't care how touchy-feely you want to get or how much training you do. It all comes from the human heart. And I believe the human heart can only get out of any kind of prejudice if they follow, in my case, what I consider biblical principles. Am I always 100% at it? Absolutely not. I'm human. I make mistakes like everybody else. But I'm saying, until then, we need to come up with a plan where all people come together, look at the best plan we can to balance so that everybody feels like they are treated fairly, that they have equal opportunity, they have equal pay, they have equal hiring practices, they have equal discipline, like in this case. So that's my measure, is to move as close to that as I can while I'm sheriff. Next sheriff will have to pick it up from there.
You said when you first saw the video of Reginald Arrington being arrested, you thought it was disturbing. first view of it. Do you still feel that way now?
I don't know that disturbing is the right word, I may have used it, but it's horrible to look at something like that, even if the officers are following the rules of engagement. What you have to do is analyze, forensically analyze every frame to see at what point this went south, why did it go south, what were the circumstances under which the officers arrived, what were the victims claiming went on, what did the defendant claim went on, at what point did the defendant quit cooperating and decided, I'm not going to cooperate, even after repeated, sir, just be still, be still. I can't judge that. That's why the courts are there. That's why your administrative review there. That's why your IA is there. That's why lawyers are there. That's why judges are there. It's a long-term process. What I'm saying to people in general is police work is not touchy-feely work. There comes a point, if you're going to be an officer, when you're going to have to take action, and you're going to have to gain compliance. Because if you don't have compliance, you're going to have anarchy. That's what I'm saying.
And you did say horrible. You didn't say disturbing. That was my bad.
Okay,
Those 5 officers are still working, right? Or deputies?
Yeah, you know, the first time the district attorney, and again, I'm sure the district attorney thinks I throw him under the bus. I think he throws me under the bus when he took some of the action he did. But the first time this happened is in the Kirkpatrick case. You all are aware of that. The fault in that case not being resolved is not the local level. It's because it's been laying at the Department of Justice for 17 months. That agency of all agencies ought to be able to come up with a solution quicker than this. And I get irritated when month after month after month I get no response from Washington on what that case is about. A case of that magnitude can be resolved in my field, and I'm just a sheriff in a little southern county, can be resolved quicker than 17 months. I chose to put him off work because the video went on a little longer and it showed some things that caused a lot of uproar in the community. And I, very frankly, I made the decision at first to take him off duty and put him on desk duty. Well, there was such community uproar that I decided I would go ahead and do that, never dreaming this would take months and months to either terminate him and indict him or find him innocent and put him back to work. When this incident happened the other day, I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm gutting my men. All it would take is every time somebody gets out there and raises sand, another officer gets let off. Pretty soon we don't have anybody to police. So what I did was take the position that we'll see what happens in preliminary court. And then the DA decided he wasn't going to send it to preliminary court. He was going to automatically send it to the TBI and the FBI. TBI turns around pretty quick. You can't do that. I did talk with the district attorney. I told him my concerns. I said, let this thing go before a magistrate. But the DA has the power to dismiss it, and he chose to, without anybody else involved. I personally think that's wrong. I think it ought to go before a magistrate, or it ought to go before a preliminary hearing. That didn't happen. It still hadn't happened. So we're where we are, where this case could very possibly wind into the same circumstances. A year and a half later, we're still back here talking about it. I hope that's not the case. I will tell you this. If any court, if any indictment comes down, I have no choice but to terminate that person until they wake it through. I don't like it. I may not like to do it. I may think they're innocent. But as sheriff, I can't take that position. I got to be neutral until the court, the wheels of justice, finish turning. Maybe one more question.
To the people who have written this letter and are continue to address you, if you had, one message that you wanted to tell them, what would you want them to know? If these people say that they're hurting and they're upset, what is something you think you could tell them to mend whatever they are upset about?
I have an EEOC officer. He's an African American officer. His job is to, as a captain in the sheriff's department, to look at the community's concerns about what we do, put together representatives from the community to meet with me to talk about it. So far that hasn't come to fruition. For whatever reason, all they want to do is demand I do things. I don't know any of the names unless, I didn't look that close, but I couldn't readily recognize any name on that list. I've told my EEOC officer, Captain Hinton, I'd be more than happy to sit down with a small representative group of the African American community, the Hispanic community, the female community. I've actually got 5 ladies coming to see me next week who just want to sit down and talk about things. I'm more than welcome to do that. I'm going to make it a working lunch. You won't find me run from it. You won't find me run from news conference. That's not my style. I'd rather deal with it out there. But I've said the same thing about the Ministerial Association. If you want to get a balance in the Ministerial Association, of whites and blacks, or even all African Americans. If you want to just get to the point, how can you help me hire more men and women from that community? That can only happen if we sit and talk. The third group I've asked to meet with is folks about all three of your ages, people under 30 for the most part. I guess all of you are under 30. Who are the next generation? Come sit down with me and say, Sheriff, this is what we think it ought to look like 15, 20 years from now. Maybe we'll have a female sheriff. Maybe we'll have some captains. I'm not fearful of that. I'd be more than happy to sit down. Thank you all for being here today. I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you,
Again,
Sheriff.
as far as this group, I think it was wrong the way they did it, just like last time. I think they're trying to gain attention from the press rather than sit down and talk with the sheriff.
And right before you wrap up, is that how you move forward with people like this, the clergy, just sitting down, talk, having conversations, just like you did with the Deltas?
I think so. I think you do it not only with clergy, but as I said, with the generation that's getting ready to take over the reins, and the business community perhaps. But those are the groups I think can come and say, Sheriff, put aside what's happening. Let's talk about what we can do to get the balance we need.
And what compromise can you make?
I don't know. I'll hear their demands. I can tell you that it's not a matter of compromise. It's a matter of better training, better relations, but it's not necessarily changing a policy unless that standard is seen at a national level to be unworkable and needs to be changed. Nobody has showed me any policy yet. All I've heard is what people claim they saw. Therefore, that must be wrong. They would do away with batons. They would do away with tasers. They would do away with anything but an officer's voice. And if the officer can't get compliance on his voice, he needs to just take the cuffs off and let him walk away. That's not going to happen in my watch.
Thank you, sir,
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
much.